Coming up, an almost forgotten chapter of Alaska history.
Your family is a treasure. Until you lose those treasures, you don't realize how valuable they really are.
The Great Flu of 1919.
People were falling over dead just as they were walking.
How sickness swept through Bristol Bay and left orphans in its wake.
So many adults passed, leaving all these children starving for love.
Ahead, a year of death and survival in Bristol Bay.
Alaska, where there are old triumphs, but also new frontiers, with challenges as great as the state itself, but a belief that the best is yet to come, bringing you the faces, the places, and the spirit of the last frontier. This is Frontiers with Rhonda McBride.
Welcome to Frontiers. In this show, we bring you a story of death and survival. What happened when the Spanish flu swept through Bristol Bay? The year was 1919, 1 year after it had ravaged the rest of the world. But this remote part of western Alaska had not yet seen the devastation experienced elsewhere in Alaska. But in the month of May that year, a second wave of the flu struck as canneries along the coast of Bristol Bay prepared for the summer salmon run. In December of 1918, a dog team brought word that the flu epidemic could be headed to Bristol Bay. Alaska's territorial governor, Thomas Riggs, sent a special messenger to issue a quarantine that banned travel, closed schools and churches, and forbid dances and other entertainment. At first, it seemed the flu had run its course, until the spring, when a cannery in Naknek saw its first cases, which coincided with the arrival of the Kwiak, an Alaska Packers Association steamship. Dr. Frederick Spencer, APA's medical officer, wrote,
"We had rumors of the epidemic farther north for several days, and our first case presented on the morning of May 26th. Other cases rapidly developed the same day, and within 48 hours, all natives of the village were stricken, men, women, and children alike."
Soon, the epidemic would claim 40% of the adult population of Bristol Bay. Had it not been for the canneries, fewer would have survived. They had doctors, nurses.
So over this way is the bunkhouses.
And in the case of the Diamond NN Cannery in South Naknek, a hospital.
This is growing up very fast.
The Diamond NN Cannery is still here. It's Carvel Zimmons' job to watch over what feels more like a ghost town.
This is the hospital.
You can still see what's left of the hospital where the flu victims were brought for treatment 100 years ago.
The doctor's office was here.
Some of the children who lost their parents were treated here and cared for at the cannery until an orphanage could be set up in Cannery, a village near Dillingham. Carvel Zimmons' grandmother, Mary, was one of those children. He remembers her stories.
People were falling over dead just as they were walking.
Carvel's grandmother came from Savanoski, a village that was abandoned after the flu.
There was even a mass grave that was dug up there. They were falling over so fast that I believe there was one grave that had 99 people in it.
The canneries were outposts of the modern world in a region where most of the natives lived in earthen homes and kept dogs for transportation. A Coast Guard officer on the cutter Analga described in his diary the devastation he saw in one settlement.
"I was unexpectedly confronted by 3 big Malamutes. Broke through the windows and shot the dogs. 2 skulls and many large bones, all picked clean, scattered over the floor, and evidence that the dogs had been fighting over the remains."
The Diamond NN plant was part of a chain of canneries owned by the Alaska Packers Association, each named with a different letter of the alphabet. Many of the packing plants use their own supplies and manpower to help the locals survive. They also buried the dead. Governor Riggs asked the association to give him a list of what they had spent so that they could be compensated. But Henry Fortman, president of the APA, wrote back that it would be too difficult to calculate how much the association had spent. He said, "We feel ourselves well paid by the knowledge that we were able to relieve the suffering." This cannery and others saw plenty of suffering. The superintendent, J.F. Heimbachel, described an eerie scene when a sailboat drifted ashore.
3 small children suffering with influenza came up the beach and reported that 2 men were dead in the boat.
Children never to see their parents again. Children whose lives in a matter of days changed forever. A story of death and survival they were too young to fully understand. The Spanish flu finally left Alaska in 1919, but continued to spread to other parts of the world into 1920. At least 50 million died, more than the total number of deaths from World War II. The average age of those who died was 28. Up next, life after the Great Flu of 1919. What happened to the children who lost their parents? The 1920 census counted 110 orphans housed at an orphanage at Cannery, run by Dr. Linus French, who cared for the children even as he fought the flu himself. He was also a photographer, and his pictures of the orphans, you can see in them the faces of their children and their grandchildren to come.
Your family is a treasure.
Many of those who work here at the Bristol Bay Native Corporation are descendants of the children who survived the epidemic. The corporation marked the 100-year anniversary of the Great Flu of 1919 with this display of photos.
Auntie Mary Zimmern and Auntie Annie.
Vicky Alto's grandmother, Nina Harris, is not pictured here in this photo of the orphans, but there is a sign she's nearby.
She must have been there because she's got bows that my grandma tied in all her girls' hairs. So she must have been here.
Nina was 16 when the flu struck. Out of a family with 13 kids, only 3 survived, Nina and her 2 sisters, Mary and Annie. Before their mother died, she said,
"Go away, and maybe you'll live."
And they did, to a ripe old age. But at first, it seemed they were doomed. Nina took them to the closest cannery, all of them sick with the flu, but no one around to help.
The only thing she found to eat was a case of rotten onions. So she got down to the middle of the onions and made a really strong soup, salty soup, and she'd give eyedroppers, drops in the kids' mouths, in Auntie Annie and Auntie Mary's mouths, in hopes that they would live.
And somehow they did.
Auntie Mary started wiggling, talking in Yupik. "What do? You trying to kill me?" And Grandma was so happy. She hugged her and loved her.
If you know what to look for, each picture has so much to say.
He's going to help out.
Like this photo, which appears to be of 2 boys, but one child is a girl, her hair cut short to prevent the spread of lice.
Her eyes are sad, her mouth is turned down. She looks like she's on the verge of crying, and he's trying to comfort her. The little girl who doesn't understand what's happened to her.
My great-grandma Nina and her great-grandma Mary were sisters. And so we're kind of the 4th generation descendants from them.
Vicky, her daughter Sienna Huffman, and her Auntie Mary's great-granddaughter Sonia Stewart look through a new book with stories from survivors.
Yeah, this paragraph here is just pretty impactful. Like in 1990, the flu came. We lost all the family. Everyone passed away. My mother, sister, and brother, all in the same month.
Words from Sonia's great-grandmother Mary Zimmern. the little girl with the big bows.
This is one of my favorite photos. It's a picture of the orphans being transported from Sevenoski to the NN Cannery.
Many of the children here are old enough to remember another tragedy, a volcanic eruption in 1912 that sent them trudging through miles of ash to start a new village.
This picture really tells that story for me, that no matter how many times they've had to move, that they persevered.
I have a young baby at home, so this one really touches me the most. For a baby to lose their mother or their parents to me, I think that's, you know, the most heartbreaking.
But there are photographs here that lift the heart.
Look, they're dragging something.
Wow.
Like a team of horses.
They're a lot cleaner.
Yeah.
There are more smiles on their faces.
Yep.
Signs that some have begun to heal.
He's already a worker bee.
And grow strong.
It looks like he's ready to stand up and be a leader.
1919, more than a story about death, but also one of courage and hope.
Wow, this is so cool, all these pictures.
Up next, Dr. Linus French. What makes him the hero of our story of death and survival? Also ahead, Tim Troll and Katie Ringsmith join us here, two historians to help us reflect on both then and now. With the publicity around the 100-year anniversary of the Bristol Bay flu epidemic, a lot of Alaskans are asking, how come we never heard this story before? Well, sometimes those forgotten stories are some of the best, especially in Alaska. And joining us now to show us why, Tim Troll, the author of Bristol Bay Remembers, this book right here, and Katie Ringsmith, who is a historian who teaches at the University of Alaska Anchorage, joins us to give us the full picture. One of the things that we should start off talking about is, you know, of course, the canneries helped a lot, but maybe they should have, because maybe it started with their workers coming in to Bristol Bay. What's the story on how it all started?
Well, we really don't know. I mean, we have the records that were provided to us by the Alaska Packers Association that generally indicate that when they arrived in May of 1919, the flu had already been there. There is some contemporaneous accounts of maybe it came in during Russian Easter with a priest somewhere, but nobody really knows. And we do see that it seems to have popped up in different places in Bristol Bay about the same time. So it could have come in on cannery ships that didn't keep records like the APA, but we really don't know.
And they could have just come in from all different ways, but you know, what is the significance of the cannery's presence there? Do you think it could have been worse? I mean, it was 40% of the adult population is estimated to have died. Had the canneries not been there with their medical facilities?
Right. I mean, the canneries had hospitals, at least some of them did. The Alaska Packers had 7 in all of Alaska, and they had 2 on the east side of Bristol Bay. And those hospitals not only provided health care for the cannery crews, but also for the residents as well. And, you know, it probably very much helped to have that health care boots on the ground when the epidemic struck.
And it's hard to imagine just how remote and isolated this area was. I mean, did the canneries kind of truly serve as an outpost in the modern world?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, they brought the modern world to Bristol Bay. You know, they electrified Bristol Bay. They brought wireless communications with the outside world. So in many ways, the canneries were very much represented.
You know, and in your book, Tim, you know, which I just love because it has original documents in them, and there's talk of, you know, them using telegraph to communicate with ships out in the ocean to go check on things, and you get the feeling that there's no responsibility of anybody in this. Like, who's responsible to address this, because we were a territory at the time?
Yeah.
Well, certainly Governor Riggs was trying to make sure that the federal government responded, and that's a story in itself. And to the credit of the canneries, they saw that they were really the only ones that could capably respond in a big manner, and they did. I mean, we had a government hospital at Cannery with a Dr. French and 2 nurses, but there was only so much they could do because they were overwhelmed and sick themselves. And had the canneries not taken the initiative, to respond. God knows what more would have happened.
So let's talk a little bit about how this whole thing got started, your book, Bristol Bay Remembers. Apparently it started with a box that came to the museum in Dillingham while you were a volunteer. What did this Pandora's box open for you?
Well, for me, it was a box that was sent up from a family in Lopez, Washington, to Dillingham by a fisherman. And I was called by the city office to come down and take a look at it, and I did, and we opened it up, and there were all these beautiful things in it, ivory carved buttons and watch chains, and a note that said it was from the family of Dr. Linus French, who was a doctor at Cannery, these were all given to him because they liked him so much, and we felt it was appropriate to give it back to the community.
And so you called the family.
I did, and you know, surprisingly, I said, hey, did he have anything more, like diaries or photographs? And it turns out he was an early photographer in the region and kept copious diaries, and as all of his official correspondence. So we were able to get all that from the family, and after looking at it really for years, you know, you piece together and look at the photographs, and we began to realize that this was the doctor who started the hospital in the Dillingham in Bristol Bay, and that many
He's
of
kind
these...
of, you call him in your book the Cannery visionary. What kind of a guy was he?
Well, he must have been a real boisterous and outgoing person from what we know. He seemed to really have a passion for the people there.
We have a photograph of him. He looks kind of formal in this, but it sounds like he wore a lot of hats.
Yeah, this was probably taken before he came to Dillingham area. But you get the feeling that, yes, he was a doctor, but he also really had a great feeling for the people there, and it was a great adventure. I mean, he was single at the time.
He went to his patients with reindeer and dog
herds
teams.
and dog teams. He was in charge of all the reindeer herds in the region. And then also took photographs. And it's the photographs that are a real treasure, because you can really piece this story together. And it was through looking at these photographs and realizing there are these just bunches of kids that we see that, he was here when the Spanish flu arrived in 1919.
So what about the nurses? I mean, you write about Dr. French in your book, but also give a lot of credit to the nurses.
Well, certainly there were nurses that came and went through this time, but at this period there was nurses, Rhoda Ray and Mamie Conley, who were at the hospital in 1917, 1918. And just from the accounts we have of how they responded, because they were not only caring for the sick and the dying, they also had children on their hands. And you read the stories of trying to care for the children, do all the laundry, do all the wash, and you know, independent observers coming in said if these two nurses had been heroes in a field of battle, they would have been given all the appropriate awards. But for the most part, nobody knew. But certainly I'm glad that we can recognize them now for what they did.
Now, Katie, you grew up sort of in a cannery environment. You refer to yourself sometimes as a cannery brat. So what was your entryway into the story of the flu?
Well, my father, Gary Johnson, he was the superintendent at the NN Cannery for many, many years. In fact, he represented the very last Alaska Packers superintendent in Alaska when he retired. So as a child who grew up in Seattle, I liked the salmon, came to Bristol Bay every summer, returned. I eventually worked my way through college on the slime line and became a historian. In many ways, it was the experience of the cannery that made me appreciate the history.
And what is it about this story that really gives you an appreciation of the cannery history?
Well, I was actually at a conference, the Alaska Historical Society conference, where Tim showed some of these photographs. And it was really then, and I made the connection, the cannery at South Naknek has the hospital, and that's when I realized that this is a story of incredibly important historical significance that goes far beyond just putting fish into a can. This is the story of the flu, and it happened right there, and those buildings contain much of this history.
So we have some more photographs to show you, and you know, if you could look at some of these pictures, you know, you get a sense of what's going on, but you can't hear what's going on. What would we hear, Tim, if we were there?
Well, in this particular photograph, I think we have girls with a story knife drawing stories in the sand, which is something very typical of Yupik girls at the time growing up in the village.
And they would have been speaking Yupik.
And they would have been speaking their native language, would have been Yupik. This is some photographs that Dr. French took on some of his trips. This is, we believe, a Barabra near the village of Cannery, not far from the hospital. This is a photograph from Kalukuk area in these wonderful bird parkas.
So these people are really immersed in their culture, and this Western culture
And to look
comes
at these,
in.
and to realize that some of these photos, those people died in the flu.
Yeah.
These are taken just a little bit earlier.
So what about the children that were, you know, left as orphans after the flu? What kind of life did they have growing up?
Well, growing up at the hospital, obviously, it was a totally different situation. They're now in with a group of other people. They're in an orphanage. They're actually being told not to speak their native languages anymore. And so they're in a group situation totally unlike what they would have experienced growing up in their villages.
So when we look at photographs of them, and here they are, it looks like they're pulling some kind of a cart. What do these photos say to you, Katie, when you look at them?
When I see these children, you know, as a mother of 2 children, I think what extraordinary, courageous young people they are, how resilient those children are, and how they are the bearers of their culture and the continuation of it.
Because the culture is strong.
Yeah, it's
growing stronger even today.
It may not have been the same as it was prior to the flu, but they figured out how to, you know, take with them from the past and adapt to the future. And you know, Bristol Bay are some of the most important Alaska leaders, you know, so.
That have come out of this generation.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about Savinoski, because that village just about disappeared completely after the flu.
Right, so Old Savinoski was lost because of the eruption over up in 1912, and so people relocated to New Savinoski, which was located about 5 miles from the cannery up the Naknek River.
So in this picture, the kids, some of those who lived through that, are being moved a second time.
7 years later, they get hit with the flu, and the canners responded. And in this photograph, we are seeing the cannery basically taking the entire village to the cannery for health care.
And so these are all that are left from Savinoski.
Yeah, the people who survived the largest eruption of the 20th century, about a quarter of them passed away. They were buried, the dead were buried in a mass grave because they couldn't get the lumber upriver to bury people. So the rest were taken to South Naknek, and many of these people were going to become the descendants of the South Naknek village we know today.
So let's quickly look at a map of the region. Were there any villages that were spared that we know of?
Yes, so the superintendent oversaw Naknek, Igigik, and Ugashik. And interestingly, Igigik was spared, but Naknek and Ugashik were particularly hit hard. And so at Naknek, the doctors went down to Ugashik, they went up to Savinoski, and so that's where those orphans came from.
Well, thank you both for bringing this very amazing story to us, because you know that is the joy of being able to look back at Alaska history. There are just so many stories, a mother lode. So thank you very much, Tim Troll, Katie Ringsmith.
You're welcome.
So the next time you come down with the flu, think back on this story, a lesson from the past that could help us tomorrow, a story history almost forgot, and as I said, really that's the best kind of story to rediscover. We want to thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.